So good afternoon and good evening and welcome to Liberated Success webinar on financing your higher education. My name is Ebony Tyler and I am the founder and executive director of Liberated Success. And today we have Dave Musser. He is a former assistant financial aid Director of Financial Aid from Northwestern University, and he will be facilitating today's webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Ebony. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen now, so I just want to make sure that everyone can see it. Just 1 second. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so hi, everyone. My name's Dave. As Ebony just mentioned, I have a background in financial aid for many years. Today I want to talk you guys through the financial aid process and give you a description of how it works, what you should look for, and just kind of explain the basics, and then give you guys a chance to ask questions and to kind of talk through the things that are most confusing or that you're most concerned about, because I think everyone's a little bit different in terms of what they find most daunting about this admittedly very complicated process. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about a number of different things in this presentation. First, we're going to talk about what we mean when we say financial aid. We're going to talk about who's eligible to get it, how much they might be eligible for. We're going to talk through the application process, so the steps that you need to take in order to apply for aid. Then we'll talk about what happens after you've applied, and then we'll give you some resources that you can use to help you get through the process once you have begun it, if you have questions that come up at that point. So let's start out at the very basic level. So what is financial aid? So there are several different types of aid. This is probably one of the most important things to understand. It doesn't all come from one source. Federal student aid is what I'm going to talk primarily about today, because that's what I know best. But there's not just one type of aid. There's also state student aid. A lot of states offer grant programs and other kinds of aid to students, typically those who attend in-state, though a very small number of states have state grants that follow you if you go outside of state. There's institutional aid, so that's things like institutional scholarships and grants to needy students. So colleges themselves often have these programs. Some of them are based on academic merit. Others are based on financial need, and some of them are based on a combination of the two. So you may be a very well-qualified student who also has a lot of financial need, and that may make you more eligible than others for a particular kind of scholarship from your institution. So there's a lot of different kinds of institutional aid programs. And then there are scholarships from other sources. So that includes outside entities that maybe have scholarship competitions, or there may be places where a local organization has, a $500 or $1,000 scholarship that they offer to a student at a nearby high school. Those scholarships from other sources really run the gamut. There's a whole range of different kinds of scholarship programs. So it's definitely worth looking into the organizations in your area. Sometimes you'll be surprised which ones offer scholarships or would be willing to offer scholarships. But you can also do national searches for big organizations that have done scholarships in the past, and I'll give you a bit more information about how to do that in just a few minutes. But those are the types of financial aid, generally speaking, that you can expect you might end up receiving. So now we've talked about sort of general types of financial aid, but there are also types within that. When we say financial aid, we basically just mean money that we're giving you to go to college. And that includes, I think, really three main types of aid. The first one is grants and scholarships. So that's the most beneficial kind of aid that you can get. That's what you really want. Those are things that don't have to be paid back. They'll help pay for all the charges at your institution, or if you have enough of them, Sometimes they'll even give you a stipend to pay for your books and supplies and other kinds of expenses that you may have through college. So grants and scholarships are aid that you don't have to repay, and you don't have to do anything else to receive, except that some of them do have requirements that you have to maintain. Some institutional or outside scholarships may have GPA requirements, things like that. But as long as you continue to meet those requirements, you'll never have to pay that money back. The second type of aid is called work study. Work study is essentially just getting a job while you're in college. That type of aid is intended to sort of fill in small amounts that students might need to pay for various kinds of expenses or personal expenses. And most students end up getting a job. If they have work study, they'll end up getting a job on campus in order to work part-time while they work on their studies. So that may show up in an award letter, which I'll talk about in a second as well, from your school that your student may be interested in. And the last type of aid is loans. So there are several different kinds of loans that the federal government and other entities offer to pay for college. The most common type of loan is called a direct loan from the federal government. Those loans, especially for undergraduate students, typically have very low interest rates and a lot of benefits, including what's called income-driven repayment, which allows you to make payments in accordance with your discretionary income, or really, it looks at how much money that you make, and it ensures that you don't have to pay more than you can afford, given the amount of income that you have. So there's a lot of benefits to getting federal loans, and so if you need to borrow, that's the type of loan to borrow, but there are a number of different types of loans that you can end up with. And again, we'll talk about those in just a second. You can see here on this slide, I gave a link here at the bottom. That link is to the federal government's webpage about different aid types. And there's a bit more information that they provide going beyond what I've talked about here today. I definitely recommend checking that out because that's a useful resource. So the second piece is to get federal student aid, you have to meet certain requirements. And all of those requirements are here on the slide. So you have to be a US citizen or a US national or an eligible non-citizen. The latter category is pretty complicated, so I'm not going to go into it here, but just suffice to say that there are certain categories of non-citizens that qualify, and you would need to ask your financial aid office if you think you fall into one of those categories. You have to have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent, which includes a GED, or you have to pass what is sometimes called an ability to benefit test that's offered at your school in order to qualify for federal student aid. So you have to demonstrate in some way, essentially, that you're prepared for post-secondary coursework, and the typical way to do it is with a high school diploma, but there are other ways, like I said, with the GED or something similar that you can qualify. The program has to be eligible, so that's something you probably don't need to worry too much about, but your school should be able to tell you which of their programs are qualified for federal student aid. Generally, a student has to have a social security number, a valid social security number in order to qualify for aid. And if you're a male student, you have to have registered for selective service and in the appropriate time frame after your 18th birthday. And you have to continue once you get into a program, once you're admitted, you have to continue making what's called satisfactory academic progress. So your school will set specific requirements for your GPA, as well as how many classes that you have to complete as you move through your program. And as long as you keep those up, generally speaking, you will continue to qualify for federal student aid throughout the time that you're in college. So that's just one thing to think about. And again, if you have questions about eligibility requirements, I've indicated a website here at the bottom that's helpful, that should help you understand those requirements. So that we talked about federal aid just now, but there are, like I mentioned before, a number of different kinds of financial aid, and they all have their own eligibility criteria. So unfortunately, it's not easy to track down exactly what those criteria are unless you have sort of narrowed in on the kinds of scholarships that you're looking at. But generally speaking, the owner of the scholarship or grant program will have a website that you can find that will tell you more about the types of requirements that you need to fulfill in order to get the aid and in order to keep it. So Federal Student Aid has a website that gives a little bit of explanation about outside scholarships and how some of those work. So I also recommend checking that out at the web address here on this slide. Okay, so this is the important topic that I'm sure everyone was waiting for. How do you figure out how much federal student aid you can get? So the federal government has a really specific formula for how it determines how much aid that you're eligible for. Essentially, it's what's called financial need in the financial aid world. And financial need is determined using two main factors, your expected family contribution, or EFC, and your cost of attendance, or COA. So the expected family contribution comes from the FAFSA. That's a number that the FAFSA spits out once you've entered all of the appropriate information and completed the FAFSA application process. And essentially, the EFC is a reflection of your family's general ability to pay for college expenses. And it may not really look right to you, and that's because the formula can't account for all the individual family circumstances. And a lot of times it doesn't reflect exactly what a family can contribute, but it's the best that the federal government can do based on what we collect from you, the families. And then cost of attendance is something that the school determines, and it's in part an estimate based on a lot of different components. So it includes things like tuition, fees, it includes room and board, so your housing and your meal expenses. And it includes a lot of other things like books and supplies that you have to purchase while you're on campus, and things that the school may not be able to know exactly how much they'll cost, like miscellaneous personal expenses. So the school will put together an estimate of all of your expenses, including what it knows and what it has to estimate. And then that'll be part of the calculation. And then the final calculation for your financial need is your total cost of attendance minus your expected family contribution equals your financial need. And that financial need is going to determine a lot about what the federal government will help you pay for when you actually apply at your institution for a federal student aid. So how is that EFC, that expected family contribution, calculated? So I won't go into great detail about how the FAFSA works, but suffice to say that it's really three major factors. The first one is your income, and your income is derived from what you indicated generally on your tax return 2 years ago. If you didn't file a tax return, then it might be calculated in some other way based on W-2s, based on other income that you may have earned in some other way. But generally speaking, it's based on your income from a few years ago. And it's a few years ago because that was intended to make it easier for you to apply early. Hopefully all of that has been locked in at this point, so you don't have to wait in order to apply for aid. You can apply for aid starting on October 1st and all the way through the entire rest of the school year. And so it makes it easier for students and their families to apply earlier to use taxes from 2 years ago. The second factor that the FAFSA considers are your assets. And unlike the income, your assets are whatever you have in cash, savings accounts, checking accounts, all of those kinds of things on the exact day that you complete the FAFSA. So that'll be, the FAFSA looks at your assets and determines how much of those assets it thinks that you can use to pay for college expenses. And it does a lot of different calculations to determine how, for example, how many people are in the household, how old the parents are, how much they need to save for retirement. It does a lot of those calculations and comes up with an amount from your assets that will be expected to go toward college expenses. And then finally, it also considers the number of children that are in the household and the number of children that are actually going to be in college in the family. And that's important because essentially, If you've got more than one child in college, the FAFSA will divide the amount that you can spend on college between those students. So that usually ends up making your expected family contribution a lot lower and qualifies you for more aid if you have multiple students attending at the same time, because that's a very expensive proposition, having two children go to college at the same time, but it does happen all the time. So the FAFSA has a way to deal with that. One very important part of the FAFSA process is determining whether a student is dependent or independent. So when we say dependent, it generally means that the family, the student's parents, are expected to provide some support for the student. And importantly, when we say parents, we mean the parent with whom the student spends. If there's a divorce situation, it's the parent with whom the student spends more than 50% of his or her time. And it also includes step parents, which is something that a lot of people don't know and don't think about in every case. But if you have a step parent and you're a dependent student, then that parent's income is going to be considered on the FAFSA as well. But generally speaking, if you're dependent, the FAFSA is going to look at both your income and assets as the student, and then it'll also look at your parents' income and assets, and it'll treat them differently because the parents have expenses generally that the student does not, but it'll consider both. Now, if the student is independent, and I'll explain how the FAFSA determines that in just a second, then the FAFSA only looks at the student's financial resources. It does not look at any resources of the student's parents. So that tends to mean that, especially if a student is going to be attending full time, it often means the student qualifies for more aid. So it's an important distinction, and it's something that may be important as you go down the road if your student meets one of the criteria that I'll explain in here in a second. So the FAFSA uses a series of questions to determine whether a student is dependent or independent. So as you can imagine, these questions are important, and you'll want to be very careful as you fill out the FAFSA to make sure that you get these right. So the questions in general are, were you born before January 1st, 1998? And that's looking if you're over 24 at the beginning of the academic year, that will make you independent. If you're married, that makes you independent. If you're working on a master's or doctorate program, if you are on active duty in the military or a veteran, and then importantly, if you have dependents who live with you and receive more than half of their support from you, so if you have kids or if you're taking care of other dependents, which could include other family members or even other people, then that will also qualify you as an independent student. And there are a couple of other questions. So if you were ever in foster court since the age of 13 or a ward of the court, that makes you independent. If you were or are an emancipated minor in your state of legal residence, that makes you independent. And then if someone other than your parents have a legal guardianship of you, or if you've ever been identified as an unaccompanied youth who was homeless or at risk of being homeless. So all of these questions are much more complicated on this page because they tend to have other requirements associated with them. But if you think any of these apply, it's probably worth asking your financial aid offices a little bit more about these items to see how it might affect you. But these will be things that are asked on the FAFSA. So be prepared to respond to these if you think you might fall into one of these categories. All right, so even more important, how much federal student aid can I get? So there are different maximum amounts that you can qualify for the various federal programs. The biggest and most important federal program is the Pell Grant. That program, if you exclude the loans, is the largest federal grant program. It's entirely need-based. So your school will calculate how much Pell you're eligible for based on what your expected family contribution is. We don't know yet what the Pell Grant maximum will be next year because Congress hasn't established a budget for next year yet. But the current maximum is $6,345. And that's if you have a zero expected family contribution, meaning that the federal government decided that based on your income and assets, it doesn't look like you can contribute anything toward your education. So you would qualify for just over $6,000 in Pell funds. Now, there are work study is usually awarded by the school, and it varies a lot because the schools have to have a pot of money that they get, and they have to decide how they spend it. So you could get anywhere from a small amount like $500 all the way up to something much larger like $2,000 or $3,000 if you want to work that much. It all depends on what the school has available for students. Now, with loans, there are very distinct limits that you can borrow each year. So for direct loans, subsidized and unsubsidized, you can borrow up to a maximum of $5,500, including both. So it's $5,500 total, but of that $5,500, generally speaking, if you have financial need, you can get $3,500 in subsidized direct loans. And subsidized direct loans, the only difference between that and an unsubsidized direct loan is that the subsidized loan, the government will pay for, will basically subsidize the interest on your loan while you're in school. So you don't have to any interest accrue while you're actually taking coursework. So that ends up being a pretty big benefit. It ends up saving you, several $1,000s over the course of your studies for most people. But both types of loans have the other benefits that I mentioned, meaning you can have income. Your repayment can be income based, and there's a lot more protections for those loans than, for example, other private loans. So the other loan here that's federal that I want to mention today is the Direct Plus loan. So the Plus loan is a loan that's designed for parents to borrow, not the student, but parents. And it's essentially designed to help parents fill in whatever the rest of the student's aid package didn't in terms of how much the student qualifies for. So when we're talking about Direct Plus loans for parents, parents can borrow up to the total cost of attendance that the school establishes, minus any other aid the student is getting. So really, you can borrow basically for any educational expenses that the school has established. And you can even ask the school to increase your cost of attendance if you have special expenses that are unique to your family. So those plus loans will pay for pretty much anything related to your cost of attendance. They do have a higher interest rate, and they do have some credit check requirements. So it's not a sure thing that parents will qualify for a plus loan, but it generally is worth looking into if you need to borrow more than the other programs will cover when the student gets his or her aid award. So there are other kinds of federal programs that beyond the ones that are on this slide. I recommend that you check out the PDF document that I've linked to here. It's worth looking at. There's other federal grant programs, including one called the Teach Grant for students who are interested in becoming teachers. So I would take a look just to see if there's anything else that you think that you might qualify for based on what your student is planning to study when you get to that stage. So one important thing, the federal government does make available what we call a FAFSA Forecaster. And this is basically just the FAFSA, but designed so that you can do an estimate without sending the results to schools. So if you want to use that, go to FAFSA.gov, find the link to Thinking About College, and just go in and enter some estimates of your income information and assets and all that. And it'll give you an estimate of what you might qualify for. It's not going to be exact, but it's one way that you can get a sense of how much you will qualify for when the student gets to college. So one thing now what I want to talk through is what the process is for actually applying for aid. So the basics for most people, you'll apply directly at FAFSA.gov. And that'll take you to the FAFSA website, and we'll talk through how that process works in just a second. With state aid, It really depends. States have a lot of different requirements. So depending on which state you live in, it may be that they consider the FAFSA to be enough to apply for aid, and many states do. Other states have applications that you have to fill out. It all depends. So definitely check in with if you have a high school guidance counselor who's familiar with the state aid program, check with that person or with financial aid offices in the state to see what that process is. So that's one thing that I highly recommend that you look into. School aid, so institutional scholarships, like we just mentioned. Typically, the schools set those requirements. And again, sometimes the requirement is as simple as just filling out the FAFSA and directing it to the school in question. Other times you have to do a much more extensive application. So that's something that you can check on directly with your school. It's a lot easier in some cases than the state aid. You just go to your financial aid office's websites or give them a call and ask them what the requirements are for the scholarships, and they can usually point you to those things. And then of course, with outside scholarships, usually you need to contact the scholarship provider in order to find out what the requirements are for the outside scholarships. Those are sometimes harder to get at as well because there's so many different providers and they all have different requirements. But if you find one that's interesting, what I recommend is just pursue it. Try every means of contacting the provider, ask them questions about what you need to do to qualify, and you can usually get good information that way. Honestly, with those, the more legwork that you do and the harder you work to track them down, the more likely it is that you'll be able to find some outside scholarships to help support you through college. So that I would strongly recommend doing that search early so that you can find some scholarship providers that may work for you. And always make sure to look at whether there are deadlines associated with these programs, because oftentimes the state will have a limited amount of aid that it can give. So it has a cutoff. A lot of states have cutoffs on when you can submit your FAFSA. So you should almost always try to submit your FAFSA as soon as possible after you have everything in place and you're ready to do that. Because the sooner that you do it, the more likely it is that you'll meet the state deadlines for applying for state aid if there is any available in your state. Okay, so let's talk through the actual process for applying for federal student aid. So the very first thing that you'll do when you want to apply for aid is that you'll create a username and password, and that's called the FSA ID. I have a link to the website here. Both you and your parent have to create one of those, and you can't share it. That's because the government wants to know that you and your parent are both the right people who are electronically signing that important application document. You have to give an email address and it has to be unique. So if anyone in your family has done an FSA ID before and they've used an email address to get that FSA ID, you can't use the same one. It has to be an entirely new email address. And remember, don't tell anyone your FSA ID, because this is how the application process works. Unfortunately, in a very small number of cases, we've had problems with identity theft and people applying for aid without the knowledge of students. So make sure that you hold on to that FSA ID and don't tell anyone because that's your ID and yours alone. Then you'll need to determine what it is that you need to apply. I didn't go into it here, but check out the websites that I've included here. A lot of what you'll need, if you filled out if you've been filing tax returns regularly, most of what you'll need will be about your assets. So make sure, everyone needs to make sure that they have a good idea of the exact dollar amount of your assets. Like I said, cash, investments, checking, savings accounts, all of those kinds of things. And that's explained in more detail on these two websites, including the second one, which is the worksheet that explains how to answer the FAFSA questions. So very important, make sure you have what you need. Once you do that, you can go into the FAFSA.gov website anytime after October 1st, as I mentioned. and this is one place where you can find the deadlines. The state deadlines are actually on the FAFSA.gov website, whereas school deadlines are not going to be, but they can usually be found on the school's websites. So take a look, make sure that you're applying early enough. Some colleges require you to apply before January 1st. So if you're interested in going to a place that has an early application system, that might be worth getting the FAFSA done sooner than later. When you start, you'll use the FSA ID to get the process moving. And then once you've started, there are a lot of ways that you can get help. There's a live chat. There's different bubbles that'll pop up when you're trying to answer a question. You can ask for help on the website, or you can call 1-800-4FED8, and that number will go to an expert with the federal government who can talk you through the question and help you answer it. And so we make sure the government has some options for folks when they don't know exactly how to answer a question. So then when you'll go through the FAFSA, at the end of the process, the FAFSA is going to ask you which schools do you want to send this to. There's no limit, so you can include as many schools as you want. And I would recommend sending it to any school that you're even thinking about applying for if you haven't actually gone through the application process, because once they have it and you actually apply at the school, generally speaking, the school can pull that record from all of what it has already received, and it'll have your FAFSA on hand as soon as you get your admission application finished with the school. So always try to put as many schools on the FAFSA as you can. Once you are completely done, you've entered all of your income, assets, all the other information that the FAFSA is asking for, then you will wait for the confirmation page that says that the form has been submitted. If you don't wait for that, you run the risk of not completing it, and that's happened to a lot of families. So you get almost all the way through it and then you log out, but it hasn't actually finished the process. You can save your progress on the FAFSA so that you can do some questions and stop and then leave and come back with your FSA ID. So that's one way that you can make this a little easier if you find that you don't know how to answer a question, you're not locked into it right then. But once you see that your FAFSA form has been submitted, then and only then should you log out and call it a day. That's the point at which you have successfully submitted the FAFSA. One thing I wanted to mention is that the FAFSA has gotten a little easier over the years. The FAFSA now allows you to automatically transfer your tax information directly from the IRS to the Department of Education, who operates the FAFSA. So that data request process will happen in the middle of the FAFSA. It will ask you if you want to transfer your tax data from the IRS. And if you do that and it works, which it does for most families, you'll be completely done with everything related to your taxes, and you'll only need to enter information about your family's assets, and then the dependency questions and the number of family members in college and in the household, et cetera, that I mentioned before. So it makes the form a lot simpler when you use that process. So do try to do that if you feel comfortable doing it. So once you complete the FAFSA, you should get a response from the federal government by email or mail confirming that the form was completed. If you notice that you've made mistakes, you can go back into the form and fix them. So again, even after you filed it, you're not locked in. You can go back and fix anything that may be wrong if you notice something. And it's possible that the school could also notice something and ask you about it. That can happen too. And in that case, a lot of times the school can even fix it for you once you give them the information that they need to correct it. But you yourselves can fix anything that you find on the FAFSA that was wrong. So don't worry about making mistakes. You can always fix those. Just make sure you do your best to get the right information on the FAFSA, and that's really all that you can do, because we know everyone makes mistakes. So now you've gotten all the way through the FAFSA process. At that point, you're waiting for emails or letters from the schools that you have applied to, because these are the ones that will actually provide the information about the aid that you've qualified for. So these are generally called award letters. So I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But these are really important because they are often the way that your school tells you what kind of scholarships you've gotten, what kind of federal aid you're qualifying for, and it tells you if you need to take any other steps in order to qualify for any of those grants or scholarships. So definitely take a very close look at these letters when you get them from schools once you've been admitted. Usually these don't come out until after you've been admitted to the school, because they don't run the financial aid calculations except for people who are admitted. So then what? Well, now if you're in a good situation, you've been admitted at a few colleges, and you'll have to compare the financial aid offers at each institution. So can be a confusing process. I'll give you a few tips in just a few seconds. But that's the next stage, is to look at how much each school is going to give you and how much it's going to cost you in order to attend, and to compare all of that. It's important to think of it in terms of not just the cost, but how good the college is and what kind of a fit the college is for you, the student, because it depends. Maybe there's a more expensive college that really fits well and that is exactly what you're looking for, that you might be willing to take out a few more loans to attend. Or you might have a school that is able to give you a lot of aid, but you're not really excited about it. So that might not be the best school for you. But it is really important to know exactly how much each school is offering, so that you have a better sense of how much you're going to end up paying if you do choose one of them. So it's important to compare all of those financial aid award offers. Keep in mind, sometimes your aid offer comes back and it may look a little strange, like it doesn't really reflect your family's circumstances. And that is especially true today during the COVID environment, where people may have lost jobs, your income situation may have changed, a lot may have changed since your tax returns 2 years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago for a lot of us. In those cases, you can contact your financial aid office directly and let them know that you have special circumstances that have changed since you last did your taxes. And they can look at your new circumstances and determine whether they can increase your aid award. So this is a really important part of the process that not everyone does. So don't get overwhelmed and think the schools aren't offering enough. There may be something that they've missed. There may be something that you got wrong on the FAFSA. There could be any number of different things that happened. So it's definitely worth reaching out to your financial aid office if it looks like you're not getting as much aid as you expected. And then once you decide which school you're actually going to attend, make sure that you stay in touch with the financial aid office, because they will be providing all the information about how you'll get your aid, when you'll get your aid. For example, you might be getting aid to help pay for your books and supplies, so you really need to know when that's going to be available. So they'll be your point of contact for everything related to the financial aid after that point. So if you're getting aid, you'll probably get to know the financial aid office pretty well during your time in college. All right, so what is in an award letter? And this is something that families ask all the time, because this is one of the more confusing parts of the process. Unlike the FAFSA, award letters are not standardized across colleges. So colleges structure them differently based on their own impression about what students need to know. Each award letter tends to have some things in common. It should generally list the types and amounts of aid that you're going to get at the college. It should tell you what your total cost of attendance is as it was estimated by the college. And it should give you some instructions about what the next steps are to qualify for any of that aid, if any other steps are needed. But the letters sometimes make it look like you're getting more aid than you might actually be getting. So on this next slide, I talk a little bit about how the colleges sometimes they lump loans in with grants. They make the programs look as though you won't have to pay them back. So the best thing that you can do, in my view, is to determine the net price. So this is a really important concept in the financial aid world. Essentially, your net price is the total cost of attendance minus your grant and scholarship aid. So what it's really looking at is how much is it actually going to to go to college this year, not including the grants and scholarships, all the things that you don't have to pay back that the school is offering. So when you know that net price, it's a lot easier to compare that price with the price at other schools and see what it is they're really offering. So I'll give you an example about how to calculate net price, and this is a lot of award letters will include information a lot like this. So it's one way for you to determine kind of what the deal that they're offering really is. So first, the colleges will usually give you a cost of attendance. And again, this is their estimate of how much it'll cost you to go to college for this 1 year. So these are, by the way, all of this is annual. Colleges tend not to give you more than one financial aid award per year. They'll typically do it year by year, partly because that's how the government does it, but also because their own aid budgets change year to year. So they typically will only give you enough information for 1 year. So in this example, the school estimated that you would have to spend your total costs are $16,000, and that includes your tuition and fees. If you're going to live on campus, it includes your room and board. If you're living off campus, it includes an estimate of what it will cost to have room and board off campus, and it includes the cost of your books and supplies. So all of that is lumped together in this estimate of your total costs for the year. All right, now let's determine what the amount of grant aid is that you're going to get. So in this case, there's a $6,000 Pell Grant. That's great. That's all grant aid that you don't have to repay. And there's an institutional scholarship of $2,000. That's also grant aid, and that scholarship is not something that you're going to have to repay either. So your net price here is $8,000. It's the $16,000 minus the Pell Grant minus the scholarship. $8,000 is what you're going to have to cover through some combination of loans, money that you saved, or work study. You might be able to cover some of those expenses by getting a job on campus. But those loans and work study are not grants that are going directly to you. You're going to eventually have to repay those, or in the case of work study, that's just wages that the school is assigning you. The good thing about work study is that it makes jobs really easy to get on campus because the feds pay for part of your wages, but it doesn't do anything else. Those are just wages that you'll earn from a job while you're on campus for the most part. But so the really key things are look for the grants and the scholarships, because those are the things that'll really tell you what the discount is. And then if you can determine what the net price is, you can do that with all of your award letters, and that'll give you a good idea of what the deal is at each school and whether it's worth it to you to attend one of them. So that's my recommendation. It's one good way to kind of get a sense of what's available. Now, keep in mind that even though you calculated your net price at $8,000, you still have these other resources to help you pay for that $8,000. So you've got this $3,500 subsidized direct loan. You've got this $2,000 unsubsidized direct loan, and that'll cover another $5,500 of that $8,000. So you'll only have a small amount to cover with cash or with a plus loan or with some other form of financing to get you to where you've covered all of your college expenses. And as I mentioned, the work study might fill in some of those miscellaneous expenses that come up along the way during your year in college. Okay, so that was a lot, I know, of information, but if you are interested in pursuing and getting more information, I recommend checking out studentaid.gov. It's very easy to get to. It has information that spans everything I've just talked about and delves deeply into the FAFSA and answers a lot of questions about those FAFSA questions. It's sort of a one-stop shop if you're interested in information about the FAFSA. And it also has information about scholarships and other kinds of aid programs that you can get when you're in college. So it's a good resource. You can contact the federal government by calling 1-800-4FED-AID or emailing them at studentaid@ed.gov. And they have a lot of useful information for families, including when you're right in the middle of the process. So if you feel like you need to reach out to someone, that's one way to do it. And all of those things are free. The government does make that available to families free of charge, including the FAFSA. So that's one thing. One thing to keep in mind: you should never ever pay to apply for financial aid. That's not something that you need to do in order to apply for federal aid. There are some occasions where schools will have you apply and have to pay some small amount for the institutional calculation. But generally speaking, they won't do that either. And if they do, sometimes they'll give you a waiver if you have financial need, as determined on the FAFSA. So again, don't let those things get in your way. If you think that it seems unreasonable that they're charging you a fee to apply for the institutional aid, just reach out to the financial aid office and ask them, see if there's a way that you can get that amount waived, because a lot of times they'll have a way for you to do that. All right, and with that, I will open it up for questions and let you guys talk through what you want to talk through. So thank you.
So we have one question from Malachi. How accessible is work study in certain colleges, and is it common?
Yeah, work study is quite common. Most schools have a pot of money that they will offer. The amount it's variable. It's hard to tell what you'll get, but it's likely that they'll have an award for you, and then in some cases you can ask them to increase it so that you can work more hours if you choose to. But yeah, it's a pretty common type of aid, and most colleges will have some kind of work study program for you to work in.
We have a question from Crystal. Is FastWeb still a good source for scholarships?
Yes, FastWeb is another scholarship aggregator, and they do a pretty good job of identifying sort of large organizations that have national scholarships and maybe a few other smaller ones. I would always recommend, though, that in addition, definitely FastWeb is a good place to start. In addition to that, though, do your homework and ask around in your local community, ask at other organizations around you, see what else that you can find beyond FastWeb, because often once you find one that from a local organization, there are fewer people applying for that local scholarship. So it's easier to get once you've found it. It's a lot easier to find those FastWeb scholarships, but there's often a lot of people applying for those, so they can be harder to get at times.
And we have a question from Grace Ann. What would you say is the average number of grants and scholarships a student can receive?
Oh, well, that's tough. That's it depends on a lot of things, so I couldn't really give an average. I could do an average based on family income. So if you're a family, let's say a family of 4 with 1 student in college, and you make $30,000 or less, you're probably going to have a 0 expected family contribution, and you're going to get around $6,300 in Pell, and you'll qualify for all the other kinds of aid that you can get. Now, if you bump that income up to $60,000, you might still qualify for Pell. It might just be a slightly lower amount. Pell grants are prorated based on income. And if you boost that up to $90,000, so let's say it's a family of 4 with 1 student in college, and they make $90,000 a year, now you might not qualify for Pell, but you'll still qualify for work study and for the loans, and you may still, of course, get other kinds of institutional scholarships that are not need-based. And in some cases, you'll get need-based scholarships, because if a school is really expensive, some schools have really high tuition, but they also have really generous aid programs. So one thing I've told folks a lot of times is that just because you see a school has a really high tuition, don't automatically write that school off. They might have an institutional scholarship program that's really generous. So it's worth looking into, seeing whether they will be able to pay for a lot more on their end rather than the feds covering it with a Pell Grant. Once we get into the institutional aid, it's so hard to determine how much you're going to receive, and it's all based on how they calculate your student's merit, how good a student they were. It's based on financial need, like I mentioned, and it can be a lot of different factors. So it's really hard for me to give an average, unfortunately.
We have another question from Crystal. Do you receive more financial aid if you have 2 students in college?
Generally, yes. And that's because if you're talking about federal aid, the federal government basically says, all right, we've determined that you as a family can pay about, let's say, $6,000. Let's say it's, a pot of $6,000. The FAFSA will say, but you've got 2 students in college, so you have to divide that up somehow. And generally speaking, that means it'll basically break it in half. So instead of 6,000, it'll say you can only pay 3,000 for your student, because it assumes that you're going to have to split that both ways. So when you enter a number of students in college, more than one, that does tend to make your expected family contribution go down, and it increases the aid that you're eligible for.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Give it another second.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone has those burning questions that they wanted to ask?
Another question from Malachi. The money from work study is it an hourly rate?
Yes, nearly always. I think that there are a very, very small number of jobs that will do it by month or by salary, but almost all work study jobs have a specific hourly wage that you'll agree to when you start the job.
And is the work study, the wages from work study, is that applied to the students' tuition, or is it actually a job and they get to keep the money?
Great question. Generally speaking, you have to agree to let the school use your work study to pay for tuition. The default is that you just get the money just like any other wages. They'll pay you with a paycheck just like you would if you were working a part-time job anywhere else. Sometimes your school will ask, do you want us to apply these work study wages to your tuition and fees? And then it's your choice as the student whether you let them do that. You are never required to have your work study go directly to the school.
Another question from Grace Ann. When would be a good time to start showing schools that we are interested in attending there?
As soon as possible. Now, disclaimer, I'm not an admissions representative, and I've never worked in admissions. Now, I have worked closely with them, and so I'll tell you what I know just as an individual who's worked near that process. The more that you interact with the school, the better, because that tells the school that you're interested in attending. If you visit them, that's huge. They know that you're interested because you've actually come and gone on campus. You've done a tour. You've let them know that you were there. If you reach out for information, that's big. They know that you are looking at them and that you might be interested. So all of those things can be influential in whether the admissions folks think that you're serious about attending there. They have a lot of files to go through, and they don't have much time to spend on every individual file. So the more things that you can do to show them that you're really interested, the more it'll influence them, and they'll say, wow, this person really seems like they want to attend here. Let's give them extra consideration. So it's always worthwhile to and never too early to start showing schools that you're interested. Even if it's a year before, it can be a good idea.
And last question from Crystal. If colleges have 3 options for the coming spring, and one is to continue to learn remotely, does that affect your financial aid?
No. The students qualify for aid regardless of whether they have online classes or brick and mortar classes. The only thing it might change is the way the school calculates your room and board if you're living at home, but it won't be very significant. It'll be a small change if that affects anything.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much. This was very, very informative. And thank you, all of our participants. Thank you for being here. So I just want to remind you that next week we have one more webinar for the fall, and that one is going to be on how to write an effective college essay. And we have a young man named Gio Gallard who will be facilitating that webinar, and he works in admissions over at Fordham. So that's going to be a great webinar. He used to work at Fordham in admissions, so he's going to be sharing that information. So thank you so much, Dave, and we will share this PowerPoint with all of the links and the resources for today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Best of luck, everybody.